When your tarot reading doesn't add up, it's not a mistake, it's a plot twist. Think the tower in your blessings position or the 10 of cups sitting right next to the 9 of swords. If you can work through those contradictions and reconcile the cards that seem to argue with each other, you can gain valuable insight and your tarot practice grows deeper. So, how do you go from this makes no sense to a reading that feels complete? And how do you pull it all together without losing any of the nuance? That's what we're talking about today. I'll walk through how I use the question context, spread structure, and emotional tone of a reading to navigate chaotic spreads so you can turn messy readings into meaningful ones. If you caught part one of this mini series, we talked about how to make your readings flow by connecting the cards. Today, we're looking at what is almost the opposite of that. What to do when those connections fall apart, when the cards push against each other instead of falling into place. This is where your interpretive skills really get tested. Let's begin by defining card conflicts. What I mean by this is those moments where you lay out your cards and they either don't seem to go together, like, say, the Three of Cups next to the Hermit, or they don't seem to fit with the reading that you're doing, like pulling one of the so-called scary cards in what is supposed to be a positive spread position. We have all been there, and I would bet that we've all given up and shuffled the cards back into the deck at least once. There's no shame in it. These moments can be really frustrating, but they don't have to be a dead end. The key to reading these plot twists is to remember that we are never interpreting cards in a vacuum, which is something I said last week in the card combinations video. The meaning of the conflict between the cards comes through once you set it against the backdrop of the tone and the purpose of the spread, the reading that you're doing. That's when they become less frustratingly conflicting and more revealing about what you're reading about. By the way, if you want to hear a little bit more about what I mean by the idea of interpreting cards in a vacuum, you should go and check out the video that I made about bad tarot advice that I think you should ignore, because I spent some time talking about the single card daily draw and why I think it's not a very productive method for learning to actually read tarot. So that will be linked in the description if you want to check it out. We want to define the card conflict within the context of the reading. So let's break down what I actually mean by in context. A surprising card, a confusing, conflicting card is not surprising in and of itself. It's going to be a surprise relative to what you might expect. So that could be based on the question that you're answering. For instance, if you're doing a reading about a crisis, then the tower is not actually that much of a surprise if it shows up. It's still going to be shocking, but here we go, there's our tower. But it makes sense within the context of the question if you're reading about a crisis point. But if you are doing a reading for what steps should I take to improve my work-life balance, then pulling something like the Five of Pentacles is going to feel really confusing. Another context that I am referring to is the context of the other cards around your confusing card. So if we go back to our tower example here, the tower is a fiery card because it's related to Mars. So say if we have our fiery tower and then maybe we just have like watery cupsy cards around it, that might seem really confusing because it just doesn't seem to fit with the context of what's surrounding it. Another element of context is going to be the emotional tone of the reading. So if you're reading around, I don't know, next steps you want to take within your very happy, loving relationship, and then you pull something like the Eight of Cups, for instance, that's also going to feel like a bit of a what the fuck moment that you're not sure what to do with. And then finally, to link back to something I talked about in last week's video, is the idea of the narrative arc of the spread. and a reading might feel really confusing. The cards might feel like they're in conflict if you are seeing a lack of narrative coherence. If you saw last week's video, you will remember that I talked about connecting cards by finding that narrative to correct them. Sometimes the story just doesn't make sense and there isn't an obvious sequence or through line. It just feels a little bit disjointed and like it's not flowing. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the context of a reading. We've got the question that's being asked, the other cards in the spread, the emotional tone of the reading, and the narrative coherence or lack thereof in the spread. I've got three main strategies to approach these card conflicts, and they break down into your personal and external context, the internal spread architecture, and then the actual cards themselves and their emotional or tonal output. First up is this idea of framing via the external context. So the question or situation that you're reading about. And it sounds really obvious, but I think it bears repeating. Look to the question itself if your cards don't seem to make sense. It can be easy to forget that the cards you've pulled are in response to something. And if they feel really confusing, it might just be that you're not really certain of what you're actually asking in the first place. Every single card in the tarot deck can carry so many different possible meanings and interpretations. And so if you don't have a question to anchor them, they are just representations. They are just kind of a list of keywords. And what brings the reading to life is knowing what you're trying to respond to. Similarly to this, the reading that you're doing exists in response to some kind of real world situation or stakes. You're reading about something. So if things are feeling conflicting and confusing, then the sort of strategy here is to revisit the question that you're asking, not just the card meanings themselves. What kind of story are you trying to tell with this spread, or what kind of question are you trying to answer with this spread? All that being said, there's no harm in doing a reading to figure out what the hell you're actually needing to be asking. That's something that I do quite a lot. I actually do quite enjoy a vague tarot spread. So this sounds a little bit hypocritical, counterintuitive. But I think where things get tricky is if you are essentially trying to answer a question that you haven't actually asked. It's all very well to be doing a bit of a broad, vague, what advice do I need? What questions do I need to ask kind of reading, but you then do need to interpret those cards in response to that and not trying to answer other questions that you're not actually asking. So the emphasis here with this external context question framing is on the function of a card in a spread, which is created by the theme of the reading and your personal real world context. So when you're confused, try and interpret the relevance of the card to the real world context. Conflict in a spread is not necessarily a mistake. And this is where your reading style kind of takes shape and where you can really come into your own and move beyond the basics into your own tarot voice to personalize your practice. Find your signature reading style, as I often say. So the second strategy I wanted to talk about is the idea of spread position and the internal structure of the spread. So we've looked at the external context of what you're reading about, what question you're asking, and now I want to talk about the internal structure of the spread itself. So the external personal context I was talking about is about the overall purpose of the reading, and this about the internal spread structure is zoomed in a little bit more onto the roles that the cards are playing. It's important to know what you're asking about, but this is more about what exactly you're asking of the tarot cards in a particular reading. What kind of work are you expecting each tarot card to perform? This advice is going to work better when you're reading with a spread with set card positions. And in those cases, the spread position assigns a functional role to the card, which is shaping or filtering its sort of usual meaning, the kind of meaning you might come up with if you were thinking about the card in isolation. So when it comes to interpreting these cards, you want to ask something like, what kind of statement is this card trying to make in this position? What kind of work is this card doing here? So this is where you might have a negative card in a positive position, or even a positive card in a negative position. For instance, something to release, the Two of Cups. Two of Cups is usually extremely positive. It's about new connections. Some people would read it about soulmates, and you're thinking, well, I don't want to let go of my soulmate. I don't want to close off new connections and those sort of like soul level connections. You might be pulling death in the position of like a blessing or something to look forward to. And again, yes, you could see that as like a release, as an ending. All good things must come to an end, but it's not exactly a positive card. So these feel very conflicting. These feel like they're wrong. They feel impossible to interpret sometimes. But having a negative card in a positive position or vice versa doesn't negate the reading. You can instead view it as an invitation to shift the emphasis. So, with my Two of Cups as something to release example, it's not saying throw away your relationships. It's not saying walk away from powerful connections that you have. Instead, it's asking to think about how connection is functioning and how maybe types of connection in your life are getting in the way of bigger, better things. So, for instance, this could be talking about where an attachment that you have is blocking growth in other areas. It might also suggest that you're holding on to some kind of partnership out of habit or out of obligation, or I'm trying to think of keywords for the Two of Cups, and of course, everything has left my mind. Perhaps harmony is being prioritized at the cost of other goals and needs. So we're sort of reframing the card here. Again, we're not just reading it in isolation. We're not just taking the usual keywords of like love and connection and soulmates and applying that to the reading. We're thinking about what is the goal of having this card in the spread. We're looking for what needs to be released, what needs to be let go of to aid the overall goals of the reading. And I think if you're struggling to figure this one out, that might also be a sign that your spread structure needs a little bit of tweaking. I love tarot spreads. Don't get me wrong. I love tarot spreads. I love finding and trying out tarot spreads, but I think they function best when you maybe tweak them a little bit, where you really make sure you understand what it is you're asking and what the goal and the purpose of each card in the spread is. And I think that can help resolve a lot of card conflicts that might come about in a reading. So, the third strategy that I wanted to share for dealing with these conflicting cards is to look for a dominant card in the reading to find a resolution. And this is what often leans more emotional, more tonal, and is a little bit more dependent on the situation and your frame of mind when you're reading, rather than being like strictly technique and strategy and keywords. This one is going to be very much situational. And the idea here is that if things still feel really messy and I don't know what I'm looking at, I will look at which card in the reading seems to be pulling focus and like setting the emotional tone. And then I can think about if the other cards in the reading are echoing it and supporting it in some way, or if they are resisting or like actually in conflict with it, rather than just being the conflict of my brain looking at a confusing reading and going, I don't know what to do here. I want to be clear that this isn't about like a hierarchical thing of finding a correct card or like a dominant card, but is more about letting a tone that feels the most dominant, feels intuitively the most dominant, to set the mood and have the other cards sort of in response to it. This one is a little bit more intuition reliant, and so it is a little bit trickier to explain, but you want to identify the card that has the strongest emotional or even like narrative weight, and then read the other cards as either supporting or complicating that central factor. So this might be really obvious in a reading, or it might be the spread position that feels the most important or pertinent. And of course, we also want to link back to the idea of looking at your external context. For instance, I think the Nine of Swords is a card that often feels the most emotionally jarring. It's often the card that we have a bit of a gut like whoa response to. It's one of the scary cards of the tarot. But if you're reading about a situation that's literally making you lose sleep, it's kind of half of the course. It's more descriptive than it is alarming. So that might not be the most important or most impactful card in a particular reading. So, for instance, if we're doing a little 3 card past, present, future, and we pull the Eight of Wands, the Six of Cups, and the Page of Cups, I would say that the Eight of Wands feels like the dominant card here because it is the most active. And in a way, it's literally setting the stage because it's in the past position. So, this kind of active, fast moving Mercury and Sagittarius, like literally explosive card, especially here with the fireworks. That's what's kind of setting the tone for the reading. And then the Six of Cups and the Page of Cups are going to be read in support of that and kind of flavored by that Eight of Wands. And actually, I feel like this is quite a good example because immediately off the top of my head, I'm not seeing a super obvious narrative here. So we've got the Eight of Wands being that kind of foundational dominant card with this like explosive, fast moving energy. And then we see a Six of Cups here that is a little bit more stagnant. And so we could view that as a narrative, as like a decrease of energy. And then here with the Page of Cups again, it's almost like we've like done a dip and we're picking back up because the Page of Cups has this newness, is what is being suggested here with this imagery. And also our Page of Cups image here, we're in a wheelchair. At the moment, our figure is static, but they obviously have the capacity to move and to travel and kind of echo that movement in the Eight of Wands. So this Eight of Wands card is kind of setting the tone and is either going to unify or add contrast to the other cards. So here, this idea of movement and the contrast between movement in these 2 cards, where we have this kind of stillness and stagnation. And then here we have very much the potential for movement, even if our figure is not currently in motion. That contrast is brought out by the movement that is inherent in the Eight of Wands. So to sum up, when you are treated to a confusing card pool or cards that seem like they're in conflict with each other, begin by clarifying the context because, as has been said, every card has so many nuances to it, and the context that you're reading in, both your external personal context and the internal structure of the reading, will guide you on which meanings of the card you want to zone in on and apply. Sometimes things admittedly just do not seem to make sense. And this is also where I would say if you keep a tarot journal, bookmark or like highlight somehow the readings that don't make sense at the time and see if when you come back to them later, you can sort of shed some new light on them with the benefit of hindsight. I will say confusing readings are often the ones that have the most to teach you, but it's not a quick lesson. It does require time and practice and that kind of perspective that comes with hindsight. Sometimes you really do just have to dig a little bit deeper. Making meaning from messy contradictions in readings is what really tests you as a reader. But also, it is the opportunity to develop your reading style because, like many things in life, it is empowering to prove to yourself that you can do difficult things. And that also applies to tarot reading. The more you work with contradictions, the more your voice as a reader, the more your reading style kind of emerges and pushes you past like memorizing keywords to actually interpreting card relationships. And with that, I will let you go. Thank you so much for watching and for spending some time with me today. If you haven't caught last week's video, I will link it about reading card combinations. Let me know what you want to see next. If you want to stick around, then I will link some videos in the description, as well as a link to the tarot lab that I run over on Patreon. If you're interested in diving a little deeper, this month we're doing multi-deck readings. And so reading card combinations and card conflicts is really going to come in handy. Give me a like if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.